All right, thoughts on a very long engagement. Final thoughts?
The Christ metaphor was surprisingly.
You like that?
Yeah, it is very much what was a Christ figure.
Mm-hmm. Eric?
Double meaning of the title just clicked for me.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
It doesn't work in French though,
Well,
because it's in Long Dimanche de Fiançailles, which means a long Sunday of engagement.
Yeah, like
It doesn't
betrothment.
mean it's not a military engagement or a romantic engagement. It only means a romantic engagement
The pun
in
only
France.
works in English. That's actually really interesting.
So somebody got clever with the English title, but yeah, I mean
The translator did a good job there.
At first, I only thought it was the military engagement, and then like when and then like I was like, why is that the title? And then like I just recently was like, oh, it's a pun.
I know. I was gonna make a joke. I was gonna be like, oh, that sounds like a nightmare.
I'm glad you pointed out like the Christ because that would have gone right over my head. I would have been like, neat.
Well, what's interesting is all the other guys had stigmata in their hands too, right? They all shot their hands, but anyway.
Well, I mean, both the Manesh, but then the I can't remember his name. The farmer, more masculine dude.
The farmer from Dordogne.
Yeah, who like he was really like the parallels between Christ were crazy with him, like entering the tomb,
Yeah.
dying in the tomb because like the guy was like he switched his identity with the guy and then like emerging and like they find just an empty tomb essentially like.
Yeah, and then at the end when he meets Mathilde, he's like, "I'm dead. I've risen." You know.
I just gotta say this. I mean, that was really just crappy luck for him trying to hit a rat and shooting his head off, and then getting court-martialed for self-mutilation. Like that is just like the worst Tuesday ever.
I don't know why I tried to hit a rat with a loaded gun though.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think maybe shoot the rat, but
or like anything else.
Yeah, who knows? Any other thoughts on the movie? Any final thoughts on Manek's masculinity, or
Just after the mutilation reading today, just being like the fact that he lost his memory and he kind of just ended up being completely unscathed by the war compared to everybody else, which was really interesting.
well, he did lose a couple fingers.
Or he lost
He like reverted to like boyhood. I mean, he never really was not a boy, but like he like almost like reverted to infancy, like had like a true rebirth, like baptism, like
Right.
he got like the one with the mother, like the other soldier's mother, like coming and being like, "I'm your mom." Like it is like he learned to It's very interesting that like most of the war stories I've seen, they enter the war and they come out like dead or like
Prematurely old, or something.
yeah, like geriatric from the trauma they've experienced, and like he comes out like an infant again.
Yeah.
Which is like a different, also similar though.
Yeah.
Endpoint.
Listen.
I can't help but feel like he'd probably, at least in part, better off without all of the traumatic war memories, because at least he doesn't have PTSD. Like, he might not remember everything, but it's like, he and Matilda have a chance to fall in love again, and at least he doesn't have PTSD from all of the crap he got put through.
Now, we assume they'll fall in love again, but there's no guarantee.
Yeah, what if he doesn't like Matilda anymore? Imagine.
That would be heartbreaking. But
Well, there's a reason it ends with her sitting silently, like watching him tinkering away in the golden garden.
You're right. Yeah, and it was golden.
It was very like Edenic. Like it felt almost like Adam and Eve pre-fall. Like how the story ends with he's like completely innocent, and her as like a bourgeois woman is also like viewed on as like innocent.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're gonna start Saving Private Ryan today. How many of you seen it? 1, 2, 3. Okay. I will warn you, the first 20 minutes are extremely graphic and violent and gory. There's some sporadic gore and violence later too, but and I'm not going to get to World War I or World War II until Friday, so we're going to basically see the movie and without you knowing what's going on with World War II. But I don't think you need a knowledge of what happens in World War II to understand the movie. So, and I want you to be paying particular attention to, is this a pro-war movie? Or at least not an anti-war movie? And is this a new form of masculinity / heroism? And if so, who, because there are multiple characters, who is that epitome of masculinity / heroism, if there is one? Or more, I guess in a more general sense, be thinking about the presentation of masculinity of all the characters and what's their, and class too. Keep class in mind. American movies generally don't deal with class much, but this one actually kind of hits on it. So, I will also just say there's one thing that, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in American war movies, especially World War II war movies, you always have to have a group of soldiers, and there always has to be one from Brooklyn or Bronx,
Yes, of
one
course.
from Kansas or Nebraska,
Yes, of course.
or maybe Iowa,
Midwestern style.
a Southerner.
They need the like geographical diversity of all of the
And
like
one-
major.
Yep,
like,
and one guy from California. Yep. But they're always white.
And they're always the stereotypes of the place. Like
Yeah,
they
they're all
boiled down what they feel these like regions are.
right. The guy from California is a surfer, and the guy from Iowa is a farm boy. He's not from Dubuque, and he's not from Des Moines.
Yeah, he's good
from a farm.
Midwestern style.
Yeah, listen.
Where's the Wisconsin representation?
No,
Well, that's Wisconsin's Iowa enough. The Iowa or Nebraska, the good farm boys.
yeah.
Would
Yeah,
Wisconsin representation a drunk?
Perhaps.
Cheesemaker.
Cheesemaker.
Probably a drunk if we're gonna be realistic. In a war movie.
Yeah.
Fair enough. It was a war movie.
So we're going to be watching two movies that both came out. I don't remember the year, but in 1999, something like that. And they're both World War II movies. We're going to watch Saving Private Ryan, which is directed by Steven Spielberg, of course. And then we're going to be watching Thin Red Line. And they came out the same year, and they both have star-studded casts. You know, Saving Private Ryan has Tom Hanks and Vin Diesel, and you know, etc. And yeah.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, he's that guy. And then Thin Red Line has, I can't even go through all the stars. I mean, it's got George Clooney and Woody Harrelson and James Caviezel and Adrian Brody and Nick Nolte and John Travolta and John Cusack. And I mean, it's like everybody is a big star. But Thin Red Line fell off the face of the earth. It got nominated for a couple Oscars because it's really a beautiful film for a war movie. But Saving Private Ryan just cleaned up the Oscars. And since then, nobody watches Thin Red Line. Nobody talks about it. It doesn't exist. But Saving Private Ryan, I mean, some of you guys have seen it. You know, 25 years later, it's still sort of one of those movies people see. So we're going to be comparing the two, how they represent masculinity, in particular, how they represent war, heroism, whether it's possible, etc. So that'll be when we get the movie today. Thoughts about the reading?
I thought some of the educational stuff that they talked about, how like they wanted to expand schools for people that were affected by the war, but then they were like, actually, no, we're gonna be fine. I thought that was really interesting because that's still what we're doing now.
Yeah, it's true. I want to point out this reading is only about England. So she throws out a lot of numbers, and those are for England. Those are not, or Great Britain. Those are not for France or Germany or whatever. But
I think the like difference between how disabled veterans are treated and how disabled civilians are treated was like kind of both unsurprising, but also kind of interesting because like of course there's that argument of like the veterans, you know, have like lost a limb for the country or something. But at the same time, it's like a civilian who's like injured in a machine accident, like producing some of that stuff, you could argue also like lost an arm for the country or something. It's like nobody thinks about it that way.
Any other thoughts? Kevin?
Was there any like documented cases of nurses getting hurt?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of nurses who got hurt. A lot of nurses died, especially at the field stations up at the front. I mean,
Like particularly, like having like safety.
I'm sure there were. I do not. I mean, high explosive artillery shells don't respect gender. So I'm sure there were nurses who lost limbs, and I'm sure that it was probably even worse for women. First of all, they're not in the military, so the Red Cross is probably not providing disability pay or rehabilitation services.
Well, they weren't even getting paid.
Exactly.
To begin, they're volunteers to begin
Right,
with.
so they probably had zero support whatsoever. But also, I'm guessing by the beauty standards of the time, a woman lacking a limb is way less marriageable than a man lacking a limb.
And also, there was like the push to, like you had mentioned yesterday too, like the push to get like people to like men, like go marry the man even if they lost an arm or a leg, like you can still marry him. But I'm sure there was not any sort of like big push of like you can have a wife even if she's missing an arm or a leg. Like there was probably not that same.
Yeah, I mean the numbers were going to be much smaller, but still, yeah.
I was just found it kind of funny how, like with the compensation thing for how much somebody was disabled, it's like they assume the person was right-handed.
Yeah.
Like so strongly in there. It's like they were in entirely different categories, like the same injury to the right hand versus to the left hand. It's like an entirely different category. It's like that didn't account for people who are like left-handed or ambidextrous.
Right, and as a left-hander, I can tell you that the entire world is actually built. I keep pointing things out to my wife. She's like, "Oh, that is right-handed. I never noticed that." Because you're right-handed. But actually, I just want to point out that the levels of accidental death for left-handers with power tools is way higher than right-handers because all power tools are designed right-handed.
Was this the time when like Catholic schools were reinforcing that you can't use your left?
Oh yeah, they tried to correct it.
But Britain wasn't very Catholic.
No, it wasn't. But it was still. I think my generation, and I went through elementary school in the 70s. My generation was the first generation they were not correcting people. My first wife's mother, my first mother-in-law, had been corrected. She was left-handed. They made her learn how to write right-handed, etc. And she had one interesting tick her entire life, which is that if she ever had to decide which way to go, left or right, she would look the correct direction and go the wrong direction. I watched her do it over and over again. She would, it's like if you're going to turn right at the corner, she would look right and go left. It's like her brain was crosswired for having been flipped.
And I relate to that though.
Were you corrected, or you just relate to no sense of direction?
No, I have no sense of direction.
Other thoughts on the Bork reading? Yeah.
I thought there was an interesting point about like growing up masculine or like learning masculinity on page 35, where they said the deliberate injuring of another man was part of growing up.
Yeah.
And like where they talked about sports and football and how it's very much ingrained that it's masculine to hurt other men.
Yes.
Like that.
Still things true.
I don't think she mentioned it, but there's a really famous quote from a British general, I don't remember who it was, but who basically said World War I was won on the rugby pitches of England. Like the violence that English boys learned to do to each other playing rugby was preparation for winning World War I. One other thing I want to mention from the book is that she talks briefly about how men who are disabled from illness were not treated as well as men who were disabled physically.
Yeah.
And there was the British had a significant number of soldiers in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, and then fighting in Africa, and they often came down with malaria, for which there was no cure. It's parasite, so it keeps coming back. And they often got other diseases that were debilitating or damaged their lungs or what have you, and they could be disabled for life, but they did not get any, there are various parasites that were treatable at that point. That could disable you, and they did not get treated as well as the guys in France who lost an arm or a leg. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, okay.
I thought that part was interesting because it's like the fact that like as long as it was physically like visible, they were treated better, even though like disability like it's a similar thing. But what was you have no leg, like I find that odd. But
Yeah.
I don't like that.
Did you guys all see that there was a story circulating this week about this new, this company, I think it's an English company, that has now come up with artificial hands that are run by Wi-Fi from your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And they had this woman, she's had artificial hands from this company. She had lost both of her hands when she was a child from illness or something, disease that had hand. So she just has, her arms at the wrist, and they have these arms that fit over her stumps, and they're mechanical hands, but she can control them with her brain. And she said she's had like 5 generations from this company. They keep just trying it out on her because she's perfect for it. But it's controlled with her brain. And I was thinking of that when I was reading the Bork article.
Was that the clip where she took her hand off and then
Yeah,
she
and
started
that's
crawling?
Yeah. She can take the hand off and still control it over there, so it can walk around like it from the Addams Family.
That's kind of fun.
I think that may be part of the reason why like having a visible disability was like they treated those people better. It's like in theory like somebody could lie about like having lung scarring and like say that they were gassed when they weren't. But it's like if you have a missing leg, you can't lie and say that you don't. Like I mean you could get a prosthetic and then try to cover that up. It's like if you have 2 legs in working order, you can't lie and say that you lost one due to a television show. Like,
well, it got better.
It's probably the same mentality as like understanding PTSD or what they would call shell shock. I mean, it's a mental disability, inflicted upon that person. You're never going to be able to connect with that unless you have it yourself. So it's, if there's an internal injury or disability, you can't see that. You're not going to relate that as being something as serious, even though it might be, so.
Yeah, and for those of you who had the Gender and Modern Europe course last semester, I talked about it briefly, but World War I was the first, they're probably, historians are pretty sure now that the first documented cases of PTSD from war were from the Civil War, although nobody had a name for it and nobody knew what to call it or whether it was a widespread thing. But in World War I, they were very aware of what they called shell shock, which showed up as physical manifestations like paralysis or blindness, etc., that didn't seem to have a physical cause. They couldn't figure out why you were blind, but you were suddenly blind, or it showed up as the other symptoms of PTSD that we think of. World War I was the first time they tried to treat that, and they did not know what caused it. They thought maybe the reason it was called shell shock is they thought that the actual concussion of being near artillery shells going off was damaging the nerves and causing a nervous disorder. But they basically, the army, especially the U.S. armies, but also the French army and British armies, response was to basically say, label them malingerers. They didn't want to fight anymore, so they were faking it. And so one of the treatments they did in, I think it was France, was they would claim that the way to treat shell shock was with massive electroshock therapy that was, caused convulsions and all this. And they would do it with every patient in line waiting their turn, in the assumption that if you could show people how horrific this treatment is, you would suddenly be cured by standing in line and watching somebody else get that treatment. That obviously didn't fix it.
Sounds triggering, actually.
Yes, actually, yes. And so, but one of the weird side effects of World War I and World War II is that one of the things that they found was actually somewhat effective at treating PTSD was Freudian psychotherapy, talk therapy. Now, the Freudian aspect wasn't that much use, but the talk therapy part, get a bunch of men who have shell shock in a group and have them talking about it, seemed to help quite a bit. And so, especially in World War II, the US military started hiring lots of psychotherapists, and it really sort of established psychotherapy in the United States as a viable mental health treatment because of shell shock. Yeah.
I wonder what Freud would have said about people with PTSD, and I don't think much of it would have actually been helpful.
It's a good question. I mean, he did have the idea that one form of repression is if you have a traumatic experience, you repress it and it comes out in other ways. Not necessarily sexual, because everything else Freud said was about sex. But, so my sense is that, and I haven't really done much research on this, that the Freudians were pretty spot on in that this is a repressed traumatic memory and you have to bring it to the surface and sort of learn how to, as they say now, learn how to remember it without reliving it. And so in that sense, and Freud was, I mean, he lived till 1937 or 38, so he was aware of it. But I don't know if he ever wrote about it or said anything about it. Why?
I remember like reading somewhere about the Civil War and how they said that if soldiers were getting sentimental over something or reminiscing about how great life was before, the officers would put it down. They'd say, you need to stop this, because they were worried about like just the mental aspect of being away from home, and no, you can't think that way. So there was like a disconnect. Mm-hmm. So it is interesting to hear that they kind of were thinking about it then too.
Mm-hmm. We saw it a little bit with All Quiet on the Western Front with the one guy with the cherry blossoms, and he got all sentimental and he winds up deserting it.
Whenever they like sit for a while and are like talking, whenever it's not like a jokey, whenever they sit and get like into a serious conversation and All Quiet on the Western Front, it like all of them start like nervous, panicky, immediately, like very quickly, because
yeah,
I think in the moment it's probably too hard to try and process.
It probably is. Any other thoughts on the Bork? I will just point out one strange thing. I mean, I think I've mentioned this in here, but the dominant model of human nature in the late 19th century through World War I was what I would call the Rousseauian mind-body model. And this basically says human beings are made up of a biological body and a mind, and the mind is disembodied. It is not your brain. It is not a physical thing, your mind. It is immaterial, but it is where your rational thought happens. It's where your character is, your personality, etc. And in the Rousseauian vision of this, throughout the 19th century, Europeans and Americans also basically said men were minds that happened to have a body attached, but the body wasn't very important. But women were bodies that happened to have a mind attached, and the mind wasn't that important. So women were dominated by their bodies, and men were all mind. And this came out, I mean, I put up there before this list of complementary opposites, mind, body, etc. And that's where this is coming from. And this is the foundation for all of those gender roles, you know, the producer, you know, consumer, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
I find that so interesting because like a woman's body, they're always so sexualized, and then like in this reading it's talking about how male's body is like made to be mutilated, and just like the dichotomy of that is crazy. How all bodies are all just, I don't know, policed basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Rousseau had a passage in the novel Emile where he says, he's talking about actual sex, but he says, a man is just a man once in a while. And the implication is men are only aware of their bodies when they're actually having sex. But a woman is dominated by her sex, and it requires a special constitution. So basically he's saying for women, reproduction is such a big part of their life, at least until menopause, that's the only important thing about them. And Rousseau idealized motherhood, and he said, women were naturally, biologically prone to affection and emotion and nurturing and et cetera, and men were rational and, et cetera. But what's interesting for the Bork reading here is that one of the reasons that mutilation is disconcerting for Europeans at that time is that men are suddenly very aware of their bodies. Right? They can't ignore their bodies. Their bodies are not just a support system for their brain. Their body is now, in some sense, determining their existence, is dominating their existence in a way. And so it forced men to be defined by their bodies in a way that they never had before. Or obviously people who were born with disabilities, et cetera, were defined by their bodies in that way. But suddenly large numbers of men who had never defined themselves through their bodies have to. They are now disabled. They now are missing a leg or whatever. And so there's a real sense in which this sort of mutilation was especially traumatic for men because it rearranged their entire identity and their sense of who they were and what they were. Right? So just an added point there. Any other thoughts on the Bork or the, anybody want to connect this to the very long engagement or polio?
I thought it was very interesting because she is a woman. You have to see. This figure.
Obviously, Audrey Tautou is a actress and is an attractive woman, but they did allude to this in the movie where the aunt says, you could find another man, and she said, Mathilde says something dismissive, no, I couldn't, but I think the implication was she said, I walk with a limp and I have polio, so I'm not graceful, I'm not feminine enough, nobody would want me because of that. But then of course the masseur is like, you've got a great body, and she's smiling to herself. So the movie kind of dances around it, but it doesn't head on address that. But it does head on address the fact that she uses that to make men feel protective and solicitous and do things for her. So. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
She's the main character, but we see her very active often. She's she's walking around or running and stuff like that. And the whole time she really is she's getting the guys who let her into the military archive and then stealing stuff.
Yeah, she's way more physically able than she lets on.
It was very interesting. There's one scene where she's running, trying to beat the car. And she's going fast.
Yeah, she going into the military archive. It seems that she only is in the wheelchair so she can stand on the wheelchair to steal stuff.
Well, the wheelchair
from
the wheelchair is a way of making the men feel comfortable that she wasn't going to be looking at stuff.
Yeah, it just seems like she was not tired really at all. She was not. She could have been walking in using her crutches or really just walking. That was just a ruse.
Yes, absolutely. And I think they really signaled that when she got off the elevator after seeing her lawyer, and she gets out of the wheelchair and folds it up, and she was just in the wheelchair to play on her lawyer's emotions.
I think she goes to the lawyer at the start, and he's like, "I'm sorry to hear your illness has got worse," and she's just sitting there, and then she's walking like a scene later.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? All right, let me talk about the Roaring Twenties. I'm afraid this is going to sound familiar to those of you who had the gender class last semester, but it's really necessary. First of all, let me finish up. I mentioned last time that in the early 1920s in Germany, there was all sorts of street fighting and political fighting and violence between communists on the one hand, who were trying to carry out a violent revolution in Germany, and the Freikorps, which were units, they were sort of private militias made up of World War I veterans who were fighting for conservative causes and were rather right-wing. The Freikorps, if you look at the Nazi SS and SA later, Freikorps members are overrepresented. So the members of the Freikorps are much more likely to go on to become Nazis than other people.
I wonder why.